So Greg, you're sitting behind one of the largest structures I've seen on your layout. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've been doing here?
Well, I wanted to have a more accurate model of what the Lindsay shops look like. That was a large part of modeling Lindsay was the locomotive shops. They closed in the early 60s and were torn down, I think, in 62. But I wanted to have a model. I'll tell you about my future plans, but the locomotive shops would have to be part of that future plan. And because it's such a large, imposing structure, I wanted to have it modeled so I could design the track plan around that. And so there was only so much I could compress in modeling this the shop, because the prototype shop held 9 locomotives, and allowing for roughly 10 to 12 inches per locomotive, I had to build it to a certain length. So it's almost full size, just to account for the locomotives, and the smoke jacks were sort of lined up for how they normally park the locomotives, or the run-through shop, if you will. And so when I modeled this, I wanted to model it with a full interior, and certainly get a feel for how the locomotives were serviced in Lindsay. Okay, so in the Lindsay shops, they had largely 2 tracks that were devoted to light repairs, being this track and this track. There's a little bit of a machine shop at the end. The first 2 tracks here are largely run-through tracks where they would have just done some light servicing. They use this first track a lot for boiler cleanouts, but largely locomotives on tracks 1 and 2 would have been there for a relatively short time and run through. They would have dumped the ashes at the end and then back through.
So let's have a look at your machine shop here. It looks to be quite detailed. Where'd you get all the components for that?
Well, I've picked up a number of the components. I always look for detail parts when I get an opportunity to go to a show like Springfield, etc. And so they're cast metal parts that I've painted and weathered and detailed. And there's a little stationary boiler there. There's an office and a privy and a foreman's desk, and just generally just to represent the kind of work and effort it takes to keep steam locomotives going.
Small titchy crane, and
that's right.
It looks like Crow River type.
Yeah, I've lost count of the various makes of the detail parts, and then each of the locomotive tracks have inspection pits below it and a series of steps, and it really portrays how much work it was to look after the steam.
Are those Pico inspection pits?
They are a number of Pico inspection pits. I think I cleared out a hobby shop of all their pits, and then we have an area to drop down drivers, etc. In the tracks 3 and 4.
Let's have a look at that.
So again, to do major repairs on some of the drive wheels, they needed a drop pit, so that's what's represented there.
Okay. Now the structure itself is quite large. What's it made of?
So it's basically, I took apart a Walther's engine house, and I combined about 4 of those kits to give me I largely wanted it for the brickwork and the windows.
Yeah.
And then the roof is scratch built. I put a fair bit of bracing into the side walls, just because it is a large structure. And when you look at photos of the prototype, you can see how much the roof moved around, because there's a lot of ripples in the roof. So I didn't necessarily model it that way, but that's the way it came out. And when you look at the prototype photos, it looks pretty realistic.
Well, let's have a look at the roof and what you did there.
So yes, this is all scratch built. There's a lot of tar paper on the roof here, a lot of smoke jacks, and there's spotlights at each end to shine on the incoming tracks. And if I flip this over, Chris, you'll see the number of the smoke jacks obviously going right through, and a lot of interior lights. So when this is all hooked up, it looks pretty impressive with all the lights shining down on each of the tracks.
That's quite a lot of work. How many hours did it take you to build this?
Well, my wife will tell you that this was on the kitchen table for far too long. I think I built it over a course of about 3 months.
Yeah.
And so when you have a structure this size on your kitchen table, it starts to probably wear thin after a while. So yeah, I would say it took me 3 months of building.
Structure building seems to be a real passion of yours. I noticed that there's a whole bunch of new structures that seem to be sitting in little corners and nooks and crannies. Is that plans for the future?
There are definite plans for the future, Chris. I've really enjoyed structure building. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there's barely room for another piece of rolling stock on the layout. So I knew that I had to stop and desist on building more Craftsman kits and populating the layout. So I looked around and I said, a lot of these structures that I have on my layout, I built as a teenager or young adult, and I also wanted to do more prototype modeling or more craftsmanship type kits. So I've been building those lately. I've been bringing them out for show and tell at our railway club, and I've really enjoyed getting into interior detailing and lighting and just working with some of the better quality Craftsman kits. So you'll see those around the layout, and that is really in my future plans. So Chris, what this shows is a Canadian National Locomotive 3239. That was one of the trains we saw in one of our opening sequences, and you see the Lindsay station in behind. And right across the street on Durham Street, this was my grandparents' house where my dad grew up. So that is an early origin of my train interest. Lindsay Town Switcher 7461. So I've modeled that engine as well, and you can see them setting out cars for a train. And again, across the station, across from the station is my grandparents' place, where my dad grew up, and it just shows a nice shot where it shows how closely my family was related to the CNR activities in Lindsay.
No trespassing signs either. Eh?
Not at that time.
Nice. Notice here, Greg, that you've got a lot of railroad paraphernalia on the wall, some really nice prototype yard limit signs, whistle crossing, and some lamps. Is there a history behind those?
There sure is, Chris. The yard limit 1 mile came from Lindsay when they were ripping out the line. I didn't think that they'd miss that sign, so I thought it'd be great in my train room.
Yeah.
Similarly, we have the yard limit sign from Lindsay as well, and kind of a beat up whistle post sign as well.
Yeah, and it looks like you've got a crossing piece too for the lifting the plow.
We've got a sign for the flanger.
Yeah, flangers.
Behind here.
Yeah.
And I've collected a series of old lanterns and switch locks, and there's no end of train stuff that I've collected over the years, books and hundreds of photographs from the Lindsay area.
Oh, this is quite the railway case you have here. Looks like an antique.
It is an antique, Chris. When my local high school were remodeling the library, and they didn't know what to do with all these old crappy wooden bookcases. So my dad was able to salvage one of them, and it turned up as a Christmas gift for me one year, and it's been one of my all-time favorites. So I tend to store locomotives that I've collected over the years that really weren't prototypical to the Lindsay area, but I've really enjoyed having this bookcase, and it's a great memory of my father.
Did your dad also have a passion for trains? Was he associated with the railway at all?
My dad, of course, grew up across from the CNR station. He had an interest in model trains to a certain extent, and I kind of picked up that passion. He did arrange for me to have a cab ride when I was about 5 years old. I was able to ride one of the locomotives. It was a SW 1200 RS diesel from the Lindsay yard area up past the grade on Victoria Avenue and all the way up to Kinmount. But my dad said I fell asleep shortly outside of Lindsay, and you know, if you could just have a video of that now, because it's all gone, it'd be such a treasure to have. But that was a great start to my train interest.